Jeff Bezos built a personal fortune so large that it passed the yearly output of whole countries, meaning the total value of everything those nations make and sell in a year. That fortune began with something completely unremarkable, which was selling books to strangers over the internet. From a cramped rented garage, wealth on this scale normally requires oil fields, railroads, or an empire handed down across generations, and none of those things existed here. What Bezos assembled instead was a kind of economic machine, a system whose separate parts quietly fed one another and grew stronger the longer it ran. Following how that machine was built, one piece at a time, is the only way to understand why his wealth reached a size older fortunes never touched. The person who built that machine held no inherited advantage at all, which makes the design itself the most unusual part of the story. Bezos was raised by a mother who was still a teenager when he was born, and his biological father ran a small bicycle shop. He worked plain jobs as a young man, including cooking behind the counter at a McDonald's, long before anyone pictured him anywhere near serious money. Nothing about that beginning handed him a fortune. So whatever edge he later held had to be something he noticed rather than something he owned. What he eventually noticed was a shift happening quietly across the wider economy that almost everyone else around him was ignoring. That shift was the internet, whose use was multiplying by roughly 2,300% a year. While he worked at a finance firm called D.E. Shaw, growth that's steep means the online world was doubling and then doubling again, spreading faster than nearly any technology in recorded history. Established companies looked at the same internet and treated it as a novelty, a place to post a simple advertisement and little else. Bezos read it instead as a wave already rising, and grasped that arriving early would matter far more than arriving perfectly. Catching that wave first, though, meant abandoning a secure and well-paid career to sell one product before anyone else could. Leaving that career looked reckless, because in the mid-1990s almost nobody believed that strangers would ever buy things over a computer. Bezos decided by imagining himself as an old man looking back on his life and asking which choice would haunt him more. He judged that a failed attempt would fade from memory quickly, while a chance never taken would gnaw at him for decades. Choosing the risk that protects you from regret, rather than the safety that protects you from failure, became the machine's very first move. All that remained afterward was to build something the conventional business world felt certain would collapse within a year or two. Books turned out to be the ideal opening move, because millions of different titles exist, far more than any physical store could stock on its shelves. A traditional bookshop is trapped by its own walls, able to hold only the titles that fit inside one building in one town. An online store carries no shelves at all, so it can offer nearly every book ever printed to nearly every person with a connection. That single quality let Amazon promise a selection no ordinary retailer could match, turning the internet's lack of physical space into a genuine weapon. Selling books this way earned almost no profit at first, however, which should have made the entire idea look like a dead end. Every business faces one basic choice about the money it earns, which is whether to hand that profit to its owners or feed it back into growing larger. Conventional companies were rewarded by investors for taking profit out quickly, reporting comfortable numbers every 3 months to keep their shareholders calm. Bezos did the reverse and deliberately surrendered those profits, spending the money on warehouses, delivery networks, and software rather than payouts. Removing profit on purpose looked careless to outsiders, yet it was the fuel that let his machine keep expanding while competitors held still. Spending your earnings only pays off if each dollar makes every future sale cheaper and easier than the sale before it. That is precisely what the spending did, because each new warehouse placed products closer to buyers and cut the cost of shipping every order. Lower shipping costs allowed lower prices attracted more customers, and more customers produced more money to build the next warehouse. This creates a loop that feeds itself, where every turn makes the following turn slightly cheaper and slightly easier than the one before. Money that grows on top of its own growth is called compounding, and Bezos was compounding an entire company rather than a bank account. Traditional firms could never start such a loop, since pulling profit out every quarter kept stripping away the fuel the loop needed to spin. A loop this large still needed a reason for customers to keep returning, or it would gradually slow and finally stop turning. Bezos supplied that reason by ordering his company to obsess over customers instead of competitors, which reversed how most businesses set their priorities. Ordinary firms study their rivals and copy whatever those rivals do, competing on the same narrow ground until their products blur together. Bezos ignored that contest and asked only what would make buying faster, cheaper, and simpler for the person on the other end. Inside meetings, he left one chair empty to represent that absent customer, forcing every decision to answer to the buyer rather than the room, because satisfied customers returned far more often. Obsessing over them was never a soft idea, but the strongest fuel the loop could burn. Fuel alone changes nothing, though, unless the machine is sharpened relentlessly by people willing to fix 1,000 tiny flaws. Bezos treated execution as more important than inspiration, believing that carrying an idea out well matters far more than the flash of having it. He pointed to Thomas Edison, whose breakthroughs came from thousands of patient experiments, rather than a single effortless stroke of genius, then ran his company the same way. Amazon tested countless small changes every day, discarding the ones that failed and keeping the rare ones that made buying even slightly better. Conventional businesses chased one large idea and guarded it fiercely, betting everything on a single product and defending it against every rival. Thousands of tiny improvements stacked over many years quietly outran any single idea, because the machine kept improving while others waited for lightning. Once every part was finally turning together, the finished machine began producing wealth at a pace ordinary life gives no way to picture. During the years Amazon's value climbed fastest, Bezos once gained more than $13 billion in a single day, more than several countries produce in a year. Across one 12-month stretch, his wealth rose by roughly $70 billion, which works out to about $9 million for every hour of every day. Broken down further, that pace meant gaining near $149,000 a minute and almost $2,500 a second. His fortune grew this way because the machine multiplied its own value, while traditional fortunes grew slowly by adding whatever profit their owners chose to withdraw. That gap is why his $204 billion in 2020 dwarfed nearly every fortune built by anyone before him. Measured against history's wealthiest and adjusting all the money for rising prices, Bezos surpassed the carmaker Henry Ford and closed in on the railroad baron Cornelius Vanderbilt. Only John D. Rockefeller clearly stood higher, holding a fortune worth around $418 billion in today's money, once equal to 3% of the whole American economy. Bezos reached his own peak, far younger than Rockefeller had, which pushed analysts to take seriously something that once sounded absurd, that he might become the first trillionaire. Their math rested on compounding, since a machine that already runs keeps producing value even when its owner stops working. Growing purely with time, a conventional fortune must be earned again each year through fresh effort, while a compounding one can climb toward $1 trillion on patience alone. The sheer size of the fortune was never proof that one man was 1,000 times cleverer than everyone around him. It grew because he spent years building a machine that multiplied value, during a rare window when the internet was multiplying customers just as fast. Every conventional business he overtook was playing a slower game, taking profit, watching rivals, and betting on single ideas while his loop compounded. Bezos himself argued that talent and intelligence are gifts a person is simply handed, while patience, discipline, and hard choices are earned. Seen that way, the real engine behind his wealth was a set of ordinary decisions repeated relentlessly, not a rare gift nobody else could copy. A fortune that once passed the wealth of entire nations turns out to rest on a handful of unglamorous habits practiced for decades. Thinking in years instead of quarters, serving customers instead of chasing rivals, and improving daily instead of waiting for genius are choices open to almost anyone. Very few people will ever assemble a machine large enough to reach hundreds of billions, and that scale leaned on a moment in history that has since passed. The logic that built it still works at any size, though which is the quiet and genuinely useful lesson hidden inside the economy of Jeff Bezos.